Okay, just mute a few people. All right, I'll just get this screen up and then we can get going. It doesn't look right. Let's see what happens. Okay. All right, so what, hopefully you can all hear me. What we're looking at is, as you can see there on the screen, that Joab negotiates the return of Absalom to Jerusalem. And we've reached a stage where David is still functioning as a king. He's still exercising judgment, but he's clearly distracted. And the distraction is the fact that his beloved son, Absalom, is in exile in Geshur. And in chapter 14, Joab establishes a ruse, a bit of trickery that will bring Absalom back to Jerusalem. And the verses we're looking at tonight are essentially a conversation between a woman of Tekoa and King David. And there's not a lot of detail to play with, but what I'd like to do is to explore some of the background, to explore some of the underpinning information, the historical context that goes into this event. And so what's the story so far? Well, Brother Adrian some time back took us through the rather unsavoury elements of chapter 13. But this is what we know. Have a look at this family tree of the family of David. This is actually a simplified version. I found a complete version, but it was so complicated that it would only just add to the confusion because there was just so many children and so many women involved. So what do we know? Well, first of all, we know that Joab, the commander of the army, is David's nephew. He is the son of one of David's sisters, Zeruiah. And also David had many children to many women. And you can see over there, on the far side there, that there's 13 more, at least that they know of, along with the notables that we have in front of us there. And but what we have on display here is a summary of the key players. And in this context, the key player is Amnon. He's driven purely by lust. And as you can see in the text on the screen, he actually rapes his half-sister Tamar, who happens to be the full sister of Absalom. And Tamar and Absalom are David's children to Maacah, M-A-A-C-A-H. And we'll talk more about her a bit later on. So anyway, Absalom waits 2 full years to establish a scenario where he could isolate Amnon. And you wonder why it took so long. Surely Absalom could have got hold of Amnon at any time. But it would appear that David was protecting Amnon from the vengeance of Absalom. And so after 2 years, Absalom seeks the company of Amnon, and David is clearly reluctant to agree. What do you want him there for? But he finally does agree, and he allowed all of his sons, including Amnon, to gather with Absalom at Baal Hazor. And while they're there, they ply Amnon with wine, and Absalom's servants kill Amnon on Absalom's instructions. And Absalom flees to Geshur. And we read that in 2 Samuel 13, verse 37. But Absalom fled and went to Talmai, the son of Ahimaaz, king of Geshur, and David mourned for his son every day. So Absalom fled and went to Geshur and was there 3 years. And the soul of King David longed to go forth unto Absalom, for he was comforted concerning Amnon, seeing he was dead. So there's a couple of things to note in these verses. Firstly, Absalom goes to Geshur, a place which has a king called Talmai. And it reads as if it's an independent kingdom, but it wasn't. And secondly, despite the heinous nature of Absalom's act, David had recovered from the mourning of Amnon, and now seem to have no axe to grind with Absalom. And as the Revised Standard Version states, the spirit of the king longed to go forth to Absalom. So let's just go back a step and explore Gesher. And the people of Gesher were an elusive people who may have been a subgroup of the Arameans who occupied the area to the northeast, including Damascus. And the Bible indicates that the Geshurites lived in this area from the time of Joshua right through to the reigns of King David and King Solomon. And originally the Bible records that although this land was given to the tribe of Manasseh, they weren't able to drive out all of the inhabitants. And so Gesher just remained. They were unable to drive out the Geshurites, and Manasseh never got control of it. And so they were still an independent people during the reign of Saul. And we can see that Gesher is on the northwest of the Lake of Galilee. And this is where the story gets interesting, especially in relation to Bible history. And it's during the last year and a half before Saul's death that the Geshurites returned to the biblical record. And during this time, David and his loyal supporters were on the run from King Saul. And because of David's league with the king of Gath and King Saul's pursuit slowing down, David was able to use this time to gain some territory for his group of 600 men, his entourage of 600 men and their families. And that's recorded in 2Samuel 27. It says that David and his men went up and made a raid upon the Geshurites and the Gizrites and the Amalekites. And shortly after David made a raid on the Geshurites, the Philistine army attacked King Saul. He was defeated in the north and he died along with his son Jonathan. And the next 7 years, as we know, was this bitter infighting between the house of Saul and the tribe of Judah, those with Saul's Ishbosheth and the house of Judah. And as we know, Saul's dynasty continued to attempt to rule over Israel in the face of Philistine threats, while David reigned as king over the southern tribe of Judah only. So with that context, let's have a go. I want you to have a look at 2 Samuel chapter 3 and verses 1 to 3, and you'll see where I'm going to. It says there, now there was long war, 2 Samuel 3 verse 1, there was long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. But David waxed stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul waxed weaker and weaker. And unto David were sons born in Hebron. And his firstborn was Amnon of Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and the second Chileab of Abigail the wife of Nabal the Carmelite, and the third Absalom, the son of Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Gesher. And so while living in Hebron during these 7 years before he unified Israel, David had many children from different women. And his fourth wife, who's not mentioned in the earlier accounts, was Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, the king of Gesher. And so it's I just think I've got something here on that. No, I haven't. I'll get to it in a minute. So it stands to reason that during the time of the raid on Gesher, or sometime shortly thereafter, King David marries the daughter of the king of Gesher. You know, it might have been a small kingdom, and it seems to have been, and the archaeological evidence says it was small, but it was actually well fortified and economically active kingdom. They've actually dug up the key city in Gesher in 2019, that recently, and they've said, look, it was pretty solid place, well fortified, and the indication that it was economically active. And more importantly, the discovery of the site and its massive gatehouse speaks to the reality of David's life and his kingdom. This foreign king desired a political marriage between King David and his daughter. And surely a king who built such a city wouldn't sort of palm off his daughter to some small tribal chieftain living in the highlands of Judah, it makes more sense that Talmai decided to link his kingdom with that of King David's when David finally had a kingdom. And in this case, she was obviously marrying up. Okay? So what do we also know? Well, what we do know is that David had a weakness for beautiful women. And there's no doubt in my mind that the daughter of the king of Geshur was very attractive. Her 2 children bear this out. Tamar is labelled a beautiful sister of Absalom and was also an object of lust for Amnon. And it's said of Absalom, the other offspring of Maachah, but in all Israel there was none so much to be praised as Absalom for his beauty. From the sole of his foot even to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. You know, I can just imagine his podiatrist marvelling at the quality of his feet. But what appears to have happened is that Geshur became a vassal state of David's kingdom. It belonged to David's empire, but it maintained its king, who had entered a strategic alliance with David via the marriage of his daughter to David. And the archaeological evidence reveals that the city continued to be inhabited throughout the reign of King David. And it's interesting to note that one commentator suggests that it could have been at this gate. I mean, it's a pretty dodgy photo, I must admit, but it was at this gate, this royal gate, that David met with Talmai and made the alliance that led to his marriage to Maachah. It's just a suggestion, but there's no proof. So why did Absalom flee to his grandfather's house? That's who Talmai was. He was his grandfather. Well, clearly David was not about to pursue his son into the royal city of Geshur, as that would break any alliance he had with Talmai. And Absalom felt safe in his mother's family home, and he stayed there for 3 years. So where are we in the story? 3 years. We're now at chapter 14, verse 1. We're 3 years after the assassination of Amnon. Absalom is safely domiciled in the family home in Geshur. David has recovered from Amnon's death. And the heart of David was again turning to Absalom. And Joab observes this in chapter 14 and at verse 1. So what's going to happen? It's time for Joab to take advantage of this. So 3 years have gone by, and still Absalom was in exile in Geshur. And though David loved his son so much, he dared not to fetch him home, because the assassination of Amnon had roused strong resentment among the rest of his family. And it's possible that more than one of them was eager to become an avenger of blood. Yet to Joab, close to the king at court, it was obvious that David yearned to have his son back again. Else, he obviously talked about him, probably every day, talked about Absalom. The last verses of chapter 13 seem to indicate that every day. So Joab's never sleeping spirit of self-interest saw in this a golden opportunity. If he could contrive Absalom's return to favour, this would be remembered to his credit when in due time Absalom succeeded his father on the throne. Amnon's gone, so Absalom seems to be the next one. And meantime, Absalom was properly handled, if Joab can control Absalom, then Joab would be the man of power in the nation. In all but name, he, Joab, would be the king. But how do we bring David to the point of decision? He would have brooded on the problem, and then a promising scheme was devised. And Joab's design was to get Absalom recalled out of banishment, his crime pardoned, and his civil death reversed. So you read in chapter 14, now Joab the son of Zeruiah perceived that the king's heart was toward Absalom. Now, what motivated Joab to do this? We've already suggested some reasons, but let's just work through the options. The first one it provided a solution to David's dilemma. Joab made himself very busy in this particular affair. As a politician that was studious by all ways possible to ingratiate himself to David and to improve his interest in his favour, that he was focused on that. And he perceived that the king's heart was toward Absalom, and that the heat of his displeasure being over, he still retained his old affection for Absalom. And David needed a friend to contrive how he might enable the return of Absalom without impeaching the honour of David's justice. And Joab, realising David was conflicted, he thought, well, I'm going to take this role on. I'm going to work out a way to get Absalom back to Jerusalem. And secondly, as a friend for Absalom, perhaps he had particular kindness for Absalom. And Joab probably looked upon him as the heir apparent, the rising sun. It was in Joab's interest to recommend himself. He readily perceived that David would be reconciled to Absalom, and therefore he thought that he should make both David and Absalom his friends. It's also suggested, and I was digging around at quite a few places, it's not a lot written on this, but I found a few things, that Joab was a statesman and there was a concern for public welfare. If he knew how much Absalom was the darling of the people, or it's assumed he was, and if David should die while he was in banishment, it might occasion a civil war between those that were for him and those that were against him. Another one is that Brother Tennant states that as Joab saw David was worn as in worn out by longing, he determined to take action. A weak king might mean a weak kingdom, and that would not do Joab any good at all. And finally, to use Absalom's reprieve from justice to his advantage. You got to think about it. Joab himself was a crook. He was a delinquent. He murdered Abner. Now, he should have been punished for that. So he was conscious to himself of the guilt of blood, and he himself was acting above public interest. So therefore, whatever favour he could procure to be shown to Absalom, he could say, well, that sort of applies to me as well. Whatever the reason, or whatever the reasons, whatever they could be, it could be this, all of the above. He wasn't just a one-dimensional person. He probably had a lot of different reasons as to why he should do this. And you think about Joab, the captain of the army. He was no ordinary soldier. He was born a man of war. He was brave. He was calculating. He was patriotic. He was knit to the king. It's only right at the end that things went off, the wheels fell off. Throughout his life, Joab's courage and loyalty to David remained unwavering until the end, when he thought that his own fortunes was declining and he reckoned wrongly and he joined a rebellion. And perhaps this is the key to his behaviour. His service to his superior was directed to his own ends. At the end of the day, Joab was looking after Joab. Okay, now that we've established some sort of motivation for Joab, let's have a look at his strategy to achieve the return of Absalom to Jerusalem. And we read that in chapter 14 and verses 2 and 3. And Joab sent to Tekoa and fetched thence a wise woman and said unto her, I pray thee, feign thyself to be a mourner, put on now mourning apparel, anoint not thyself with oil, but be as a woman that had a long time mourned for the dead, and come to the king and speak on this manner unto him. So Joab put the words in her mouth. And this generates two questions. Why did Joab choose this woman? And what was his strategy? What was the method he was going to use? So firstly, let's look at the woman. Why did he choose this woman? And the adjective applied to the woman is the word wise. It's a rather common word in the Old Testament, but context colours the meaning of that word. And as we can see, that the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament, which is a very good publication, said that the word in 2 Samuel 14 means to be shrewd. And then you have other renditions which are outlined on the screen. Quick-witted, Jerusalem Bible, cunning is the way the Septuagint puts it. Nelson, in his expository dictionary, says cleverness and shrewdness characterise this type of wisdom, I should say. And then Matthew Henry said, he speaks of one that had a quicker wit and a readier tongue than most of her neighbours. She was clearly a clever woman, and she had the skills needed to do the job that Joab required. And it's highly likely that she was paid very well for the job. Furthermore, she was known by Joab and all his advisors, because it's sort of like he just goes and gets her. People knew who she was, and it's possible that Joab, as the commander of the army, also had soldiers strategically placed throughout the land who could advise him of anything that was going on. It happens all the time. He just didn't sit down in splendid isolation. He had eyes and ears all over the kingdom, reporting to him as to what was going on. And so this woman was known, okay? He probably headed up a spy network, and it was quickly brought to his attention the skills and the intellect of this woman. And it also clearly mentions that she came from Tekoa. And as we can see on the screen there, Tekoa was south of both Jerusalem and Bethlehem. She was an out-of-towner. She would not have been known to David. When she came to David to present her case, he would have not heard that case before. He had no history of this woman. And so he had to rely on the information that she provided. It's no point getting someone from Jerusalem who's clever. He could say, how I know you? That's not true. So it was someone who had no idea who she was. And you know, is there any significance in the location of Tekoa? Well, Tekoa is not just some nondescript little backwater village. It's located in Judah, as we said, 16 kilometres south of Jerusalem. It was actually one of the cities that was fortified by Rehoboam to enhance the defences of the southern kingdom. And people who hailed from Tekoa included one of David's mighty men, the wise woman we have here, a group of workers who returned after the exile and diligently repaired parts of the walls of Jerusalem in Nehemiah. But what's interesting is in Nehemiah 3 verse 5, it says, and next unto them the Tekoites repaired, but their nobles put not their next to the work of the Lord. And you look at that and go, oh, these slack nobles, why don't they, lift a trowel and do a bit of work? But what it indicates is that it was of sufficient status and size to have a class of nobles. And you've got to remember, the ones that came back from the exile were just a smaller group than those who were originally there. That Tekoa was of sufficient status and size to have a class of nobles who, despite their self-indulgence, were materially supported by others. And it speaks of urban sophistication. And then its strategic importance is also talked about in Jeremiah. It's a proposed gathering point, and it was also a battleground for a famous victory by Jehoshaphat. The other thing, of course, is that, as we probably know, is Amos came from Tekoa, but everything about Amos was completely opposite to what Tekoa was like, which is part of the attraction of studying Amos. Now, he was completely different. He was a nondescript sycamore tree puncher and the poorest man you could ever possibly find. Completely different to the way Tekoa is normally presented. Back to the record. As we saw in verse 3, Joab coached her precisely in what she had to say and how she was to present to the king. And Joab prepared her very well. Now, she was instructed to pose as a disconsolate widow. Joab knew that such a one would have an easy access to the king. He was always ready to comfort the mourners, especially the mourning widows. And, David mentioned it among the titles of God's honour. He says, Yahweh is a defender of widows, he says in Psalm 68 and verse 5. And Job's playing on the king's compassion. Job was manipulating David to the nth degree. Now, Psalm 68, a psalm of David, outlines the glorious characteristics of God. And that psalm was written in response to the ark coming up to Jerusalem. And maybe Job was familiar. He was familiar with that psalm. And he would have known that David strove to emulate the characteristics of Yahweh. And when you think about it, it was a brilliant piece of manipulation by Joab. If anybody could get to the king, it was a widow in distress. He knew what buttons to push to get a reaction from David. And also the case she presented to the king revolved around compassion. A case of compassion to the king in which she'd have no relief but from the high court of the king. So what are we talking about? Technically, under the law, the outcome would have been the death of her son, or at the very least, banishment to a city of refuge, and Hebron was not that far away. And that was what would have been the judgment following the law. There was really only one court that could override the legalities that existed, and that was the king himself. He was the highest authority in the land. He was the equivalent of our high court. And what was she meant to do? What did Joab instruct her to do? She was to tell a story. It was a personal story, but it was a fake. The story did not represent reality. It was a parable, and it was designed to take David to a conclusion that would suit the purposes of Joab and enable the return of Absalom to Jerusalem. It wasn't real. And it was a story that led to a twist. David would be led down a certain path, and then using the judgment proclaimed by David, he would highlight his inconsistency with the banishment of Absalom. Now, does that sound familiar? It mirrors the approach of Nathan to David regarding Bathsheba, a parable with a sting in the tail. You are the man. David's caught. And that's what Joab is doing. He's playing on David's compassionate nature. He's playing on David's desire to defend widows. He is playing on David's judicial weakness. And we might say, well, how is that the case? What judicial weakness? Well, the story, as we will see, didn't lend itself to the conclusion of exoneration. Somebody had killed somebody else. Punishment was required, but punishment did not happen. So let's just work through the information and hopefully we'll see that David's ability to judge according to the law was diminished. He had no problem judging the man in Nathan's parable. No problem at all. But circumstances in the life of David have changed. He's no longer forthright in his judgment. He's reluctant to get involved in the woman of Tekoa's story, and Joab takes advantage of that. So this is her story. Let's go to it, verse 5. I'll just shut this door. Noisy wildlife out there. And verse 4, start from verse 4. And when the woman of Tekoa spake to the king, she fell on her face to the ground and did obeisances and said, Help, O king. Well, there you go. We're off to a good start. And this is widow. And the king said unto her, What aileth thee? And she said, I am indeed a widow woman, and my husband is dead. And thy handmaid had 2 sons, and they strove together in the field, and there was none to part them. But the one smote the other and slew him. And behold, the whole family is risen against thy handmaid. And they said, deliver him that smote his brother, that we may kill him for the life of his brother who he slew. And we will destroy the heir also. And so shall they quench my coal which is left, and shall not leave to my husband neither name nor remainder upon the earth. So remember, while she spoke the story, she speaks the words of Joab. And it's very well put together. Let's look at how the story is presented. Here we go. There it is. Alas, I'm a widow, my husband is dead. She says it twice. She says, I'm a widow. Okay, a widow woman, it actually says in the King James Version. My husband is dead. That's saying the same thing twice. So it's said twice. I believe there's a bit of emphasis on there. Okay? And then it says, your handmaid had 2 sons and they quarreled. Well, boys do that, don't they? It's just a little quarrel. But unfortunately, there was no one to part them. So it wasn't their fault that it went bad. There was nobody there to stop them. And no one sort of intervened and said, hey, look, hey, guys, just settle down a bit. This could lead to something bad. Okay? And then what happens is one struck the other. It's just an accident. One blow, a lucky punch, whatever it was. And we had this tragic outcome. And what else? The whole family. The numbers are stacked against me and my son. In other words, we're the victims here. We're the victims. And then finally, thus would quench my coal, which is like, in other words, that last little burning ember is going to just disappear. And the personal focus is on her own loneliness and the wiping out of the father's house and the utter ruin of her home. I mean, how good is that? How well put together is that? And the point is, the unnamed woman of Tekoa was selected because she had the ability to get the message across. She was good. Have you ever read Shakespeare just from the text? Pick it up and you read it. Pick up a copy of King Lear or Macbeth and read it. I have, and I don't see what the big deal is. What's the fuss? It really has no great impact on me. But you get those words expressed by a skilled actor, and it comes alive. And that's what she is. She's skilled. It's like I was reading the number of actors who declined roles in the Lord of the Rings, the Peter Jackson trilogy movie. And they declined because they didn't like the script. Now, Sean Connery was a case in point. He declined the role of Gandalf because the script didn't inspire him. It was a bit twee, it was clunky, it was a bit blah. But those lines, when they're expressed by Ian McKellen, sound profound and convincing. And that's what happens. The script of Job comes to life through the words of this unnamed woman of Tekoa. Look at verse 4 and 5 again. And then the woman of Tekoa spake to the king, fell on her face to the ground, and did obeisance and said, help, O king. And the king says, what aileth thee? Or as a Revised Standard Version, what's your trouble? And away she went. And David neither knew this woman or the context in which she was talking. It was a complete bolt out of the blue, expertly expressed, and David is put on the spot to provide a judgment. And what would have been his judgment? If the death was intentional, so let's read this first. He that smiteth a man so that he die shall surely be put to death. And that's the same word in 2 Samuel 14, verse 6, where one brother smote the other, exactly the same word. And he that killeth any man shall surely be put to death. Leviticus 24, verse 17, 25. Numbers 35. Moreover, you shall accept no ransom for the life of a murderer. In other words, just sort of say, look, how about if I give you so many shekels, the murderer can go scot-free? No. the law is adamant. A murderer who is guilty of death shall be put to death. But what if the death was unintentional? Well, then, of course, we have the provision of the cities of refuge. And within the Old Testament, there is provision for 6 cities of refuge where someone who has unintentionally committed murder can go and not be subject to blood revenge, provided they stay in the town, provided they do that. And Hebron, one of the 6 cities of refuge, was only 18 kilometres from Tekoa. I mean, if it was an unintentional killing, then surely that brother would now be safely ensconced in Hebron. Now, when you sit back and you analyse the story, it has flaws. You can see that it's not really watertight. Surely, if the whole family wanted to kill this boy, they would have done it by now. And if they hadn't got to him by now, then where was he? The only logical and legal response should be that he's in a city of refuge, notably Hebron, as an unintentional murderer. But the skill of the presentation of this story has caught David off guard. And this enables her to have the upper hand despite all power residing with David. He doesn't persist in asking questions. He merely tries to defer his judgment. You look at verse 8. And the king said unto the woman, Go to thine house, and I will give charge concerning thee. So his first decision, look, you go away, and I'll give some order. I'll think about it. I'll come up with something. Go home and I'll settle your case. But David didn't need to do that. The law was clear. The options are evident. What more was there to discuss? Yeah, maybe a few questions of the woman would have provided more information, but David defers judgment. You know, David's changed, hasn't he? Remember his response to Nathan after Nathan told him the story of the poor man and his ewe lamb. And David's anger was greatly kindled against the man. He said to Nathan, As Yahweh liveth, the man that has done this thing shall surely die. Judgment was swift and it was decisive and it was accurate. Not now. And it's true that David needed to gather more information, but I believe that David lacked confidence in pronouncing judgment. The reaction of David here is completely at odds with the reaction to the parable provided by Nathan. You know, after all, David had arranged the death of one of his greatest warriors in order to disguise his affair with his wife. Absalom had murdered his half-brother, yet no vengeance was enacted. Joab was able to conduct his affairs without restraint, as David lacked confidence dealing with Joab. And we're talking about a different David. And upon the presentation of her case, he promised to consider it and give orders about it. Now, while this was encouraging, the woman, well coached as to the outcome that Joab wanted, was not happy with that. Verse 9, And the woman of Tekoa said unto the king, My lord, O king, the iniquity be upon thee and on my father's house, and the king and his train be guiltless. She begged that he would immediately give judgment in her favour. And if the matter of fact was not as she presented it, and consequently a wrong judgment was given upon it, then she'll bear the blame and free the king and his throne from guilt. I need a decision now. And the implication being that the more the decision is delayed, the greater the risk that the son will die, my only son, the last of my family. And David's still reluctant to declare a judgment. Look at verse 10. And the king said, Whosoever hath aught unto thee, bring him to me, and he shall not touch thee any more. Okay, he will not touch thee anymore. Bring the person who is threatening your son to me, and I will sort it out. He won't touch you. But she wasn't the one under threat. By her story, it was the son, her only son, whose life was hanging on a thread. And David's response doesn't meet her needs, or more importantly, it doesn't meet the needs of Joab. And so verse 11, Then said she, I pray thee, let the king remember Yahweh thy God, that thou wouldest not suffer the revengers of blood to destroy any more, lest they destroy my son. And he said, as Yahweh liveth, there shall not one hair of thy son fall to the earth. So the woman's petition, this is about my son. It's not about me. This is about my son. He will die without your decision. And then final decision comes through at the end of verse 11. As Yahweh liveth, there shall not one hair of thy son fall to the earth. With persistence and an eloquence which the king bore with monumental patience, she pressed for an immediate decision. It's not about my life. She pressed for an immediate decision and she got it. As Yahweh liveth, there shall not one hair of thy son fall to the earth. She got it. The highest court in the land had put a protective order on her son. No vengeance can be enacted on him. He's free to go wherever he wanted without recrimination. He was free from the judgment of the law. And this first firm decision on oath was what she wanted. So now was the time to press home her real point, the reason why she was there. The two sons were Amnon and Absalom. And corresponding to the rest of the family seeking vengeance were David's other sons, who would have been urged on by both the fear of Absalom and their own ambitions. And David, the only possible judge in both cases, had just given an emphatic ruling that no harm should come to the manslayer. And her mask here is being thrown off. And another scene is opened. And the king's surprised, but not seemingly displeased. He doesn't seem terribly upset. And he finds that his humble petitioner, this widow woman, all of a sudden becomes his reprover and an advocate for the prince, his son, and the mouth of the people, and undertaking to represent to him their sentiments. And in verse 12, she begs his pardon and his patience for what she now was going to say. And she supposes Absalom's case to be, in effect, the same with that she had put as her sons. And therefore, if the king would protect her son, though he had slain his brother, much more ought he to protect his own son, Absalom, and fetch home his banished. Verse 13. And the woman said, wherefore then hast thou thought such a thing against the people of God? For the good God, the king doth speak this thing as one which is faulty, in that the king doth not fetch home again his banished. She doesn't name him. She doesn't need to. David longed so much after him and had him very much in her thoughts that he was soon aware by whom she meant by his banished. Couldn't the king see that, in fairness, a like decision should therefore operate in Absalom's case? You know, you forgive my son, well, forgive Absalom. You protect my son, you protect Absalom. And this handsome, regal son of his was so popular with the people that inevitably David would be deemed to be partial in his judgments if he was prepared to act one way for the obscure woman of Tekoa and differently to the son in his own case. Why then have you planned such a thing against the people of God? And this bold approach indicated the woman's great confidence in David's fairness and humanity. Realizing from the king's thoughtfulness that there was little risk of an explosion of royal displeasure, she pushes hard, she drives persuasively on. She now takes the floor and she continues until verse 17 without interruption from the king. I mean, he's the king. He's allowing himself to be reproved and to be manipulated by an alleged widow woman from out of town. And as David quickly deduced, Joab had set this up. And furthermore, the comparison between, when you look at it logically, the comparison between her scenario and that of Absalom were poles apart. Absalom's case differed very much from that which she had put to him about her two boys. Absalom did not slay his brother upon a hasty passion, but maliciously and upon an old grudge, plotted over a period of 2 years. It wasn't some impetuous striking and, oh, he's dead. He planned it for 2 years. And it didn't happen in the field where there were no witnesses. It happened at a table before all his guests. And she said, oh, my only son. Well, Absalom wasn't the only remaining son, as hers was. David had many more, and one lately born, more likely to be his successor than Absalom. So let's just read these verses. Verse 13. And the woman said, wherefore then hast thou thought such a thing against the people of God? For the king doth speak this thing as one which is faulty, in that the king doth not fetch home again his banished. And away we go. For we must needs die, and our water spilt on the ground. Verse 14, which cannot be gathered up again. Neither doth God respect any person, yet doth he devise means that his banished be not expelled from him. Now, you reading that, it's not that easy to get your head around what exactly she's saying here, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, therefore, that I am come to speak of this thing unto my lord the king, it is because the people have made me afraid, and thy handmaid said, I will now speak unto the king. It may be that the king will perform the request of his handmaid. For the king will hear to deliver his handmaid out of the hand of the man that would destroy me and my son together out of the inheritance of God. Then my handmaid saith, the word of my lord the king shall now be comfortable. For as an angel of God, so is my lord the king, to discern good and bad. Therefore the Lord thy God, Yahweh thy God, will be with thee. So that was quite a speech. So what are her arguments for the restoration of Absalom? And do they really withstand scrutiny? Well, I just think I've got the wrong verse there, so it doesn't matter. We'll move on. What are her arguments? I'll go back to that one. Why are you playing such a thing against the people of God? Yeah, okay, no worries. The decision the king convicts himself, in as much as the king does not. In other words, you've let my son, you've given him protection, and you won't give protection. So there's an inconsistency there. You've actually convicted yourself. Okay, so let's get on to the arguments. First one, it is what the people want. Well, do we know that? It's what Joab wanted. I mean, it's just like everybody says this is what we've got to do. Did everybody say that? There were some people who probably didn't really like Absalom because he killed Amnon, whatever. You have established a precedent in the case of my son. But the circumstances are significantly different, as we've talked about. This was not just some random act of violence. This was a 2-year plan to publicly execute. And it was a public execution of Amnon. We're all going to die. I mean, this is brilliant. We're all going to die, and once you're dead, it's over. And by implication, Amnon is gone. And it would be wrong for Absalom to die in exile. And this is very poor reasoning, because basically you could let any murderer get away with it by saying, well, the person was going to die anyway. Okay, just so happened they died a bit earlier than we expected. But that was dodgy reasoning, to say the least. So when you look at what she's saying, it really does not withstand scrutiny. And she wouldn't have troubled the king thus, but the people made her afraid. Now, there's a couple of ways to look at this. But one is she doesn't talk about the whole family. She talks about the people made her afraid. And she's basically saying that if we do not bring back Absalom, then things could get really bad. It would be a dangerous place to be. There'll be civil war, whatever it is. And such a connection is dubious at best. You're a reasonable man, as demonstrated in the judgment that I've received. You know what you're talking about. And that's manipulation. And then, of course, we have that massive big dose of flattery at the end. My Lord, the King, is like the angel of God to discern good and evil. Yahweh, your God, be with you. And that's really nothing but flattery. But as Brother Tennant wrote, ever since his great sin, David had been wide open to the intrigue and treachery of men. It was almost as though the judgment pronounced by Nathan had robbed him of the alertness to danger which had served him so well in the days of Saul. In some ways, the will to resist seemed to have disappeared. David was prepared to overlook the clear discrepancies of this case. He let the woman talk. He was prepared to allow himself to come to Joab's desired conclusion, because that's really what David wanted anyway. And she could say no more. Her point had been well made and it hit the mark. So she prepared to withdraw, that the king detained her, for his suspicions had been aroused. Surely she'd been put up to this by somebody, this daring strategy. Verse 18, then the king answered and said unto the woman, hide not from me, I pray thee, the thing that I shall ask thee. And the woman said, let my lord the king now speak. And the king said, is not the hand of Joab with thee in all this? And the woman answered and said, as thy soul liveth, my lord the king, none can turn to the right hand or to the left from aught that my lord the king has spoken. For thy servant Joab, he bade me, and he put all these words in the mouth of thy handmaid. And the hand of Joab is suspected by the king. It's acknowledged by the woman. She's quite open about it. And the king suspected it. It's possible that Joab had already been on Absalom's case, bring him back, whatever it was. So the conclusion was not a difficult one for David to come to. And also, he would have been surprised that such a woman as this would, in a matter of such notoriety, of her own accord, appeal to him. And he knew none so likely to set her on as Joab, who was a political man, a friend of Absalom. And as we said, she was very open. Your servant Joab bade me, if it be good, let him have the thanks. If it be ill, let him bear the blame. And then in verse 20, we read, to fetch about this form of speech hath thy servant Joab done this thing, and my Lord is wise according to the wisdom of an angel of God to know all things that are in the earth. But at the end of the day, she says to David, my Lord has wisdom like the wisdom of an angel of God to know all things that are on the earth. Really, she's saying the responsibility rests with your judgment, and by inference, you've made the right call. The woman still represents Joab. She's still in role. She's still in character. And so as we'll go on to see, David gives way. He called Joab and told him to bring young Absalom back to Jerusalem. Okay.